Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. We're glad that you all could join us for this afternoon's event. I'm Tom Hibbs from Baylor University. I'm Dean of the Honors College and also oversee our initiatives in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the American Enterprise Institute, represented by Molly Moore and friends who are here. And in a special way, I'd like to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the House D.C. If LaWanda Bornstein and Jonathan Harris could stand right here. We've had a multi-year collaboration with the House, with faculty doing research, students doing internships. The mission of the House D.C., their main location is over in Anacostia, is to transform and empower the lives of inner-city youth and their families through Christ by giving them hope, a productive future, and a changed community. I can't think of any better co-sponsor for today's event than the House D.C., so thank you all. I'd also like to thank Grant Jones and Paulette Edwards from Baylor, who have done all the background organization, the logistics. We also have Robbie George's parents with us, Joseph and Catherine George. Great to have you with us. This event is part of the Baylor Robert George Initiative in Faith, Ethics, and Public Policy, in conjunction with which Robbie holds the position of Distinguished Senior Fellow in the Institute for the Study of Religion at Baylor University. Our collaboration with Robert George gives us the opportunity at Baylor not just to feature one of the leading philosophers, legal scholars, and public intellectuals of our time. It also allows us to highlight a set of ongoing conversations in which Robbie is engaged with a host of others from a variety of religious, philosophical, and political backgrounds. So the initiative is really Baylor, Robbie, and Friends is what this initiative is, and we couldn't be happier about this. So we began the year here in this location, the academic year at least, with an event entitled The Challenge of Secularization, a Christian, Jewish, Muslim Trialogue, which featured Robbie and his friends, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And we will start next fall with an event examining the political vision of Robert Kennedy, who gave that famous speech on the day of Martin Luther King's assassination, the speech in Indianapolis, and the politics and culture of the late 1960s that will feature Robbie in conversation with another of his friends, the political philosopher Michael Sandel. Today we have a conversation that is at least as important as those conversations. Indeed, given our current cultural and political landscape, it may be the most important conversation that we can have, a conversation about the life and legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. with Robbie and his good friend Cornel West. Writing in the middle of the last century, in an essay entitled Politics and the English Language, George Orwell observed that the English language was in a bad way, as he put it. He urged the cultivation of habits of intellectual self-mastery, practices of clarity, accuracy, and concision in our thinking, speaking, and writing. Without these, Orwell warned, we would fall prey to the ready-made phrases of our culture. They will, Orwell said, come crowding in and construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you, and at need, they will perform the important service of partially concealing your meaning even from yourself. And Orwell concludes this part of the essay by saying, it is at this point that the special connection between politics and the debasement of language becomes clear. One cringes to think what Orwell might say about our public discourse today. Political rhetoric now often seems to have degenerated into a matter of ad hominem Twitter tirades and attempts to silence those with whom one disagrees. But political oratory, especially as King practiced it, was a noble endeavor. It was grounded in a wisdom about the human condition, and it was also grounded in the trustworthiness, the life witness of the character of the speaker. Although he was unsparingly critical of the elements of Western and American history that merited reproof, he also saw in the great figures of the past wisdom and eloquence, moral ideals, and practical resolution that could inform contemporary American life. What can we learn? What must we learn from the life, thought, and speeches of King himself, and also from his sources, Socrates and Gandhi, Marx and Niebuhr, Aquinas and Bunyan, the Hebrew prophets, as he was fond of calling them, Lincoln and Du Bois. For King, persuasive speech was rooted, correction, addition, accepted, and affirmed. For King, persuasive speech was rooted in a purification of the speaker's soul, and it aimed both at political change and at conversion and reconciliation. Its goal, as he wrote in an essay, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which is collected in a wonderful book that Cornel West edited called The Radical King. Highly commend this book to you. Its goal was, King said, not to defeat or humiliate an opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. Still divided over race, still plagued by poverty, both material and spiritual, still tempted to elevate means over ends. Striking to me, rereading those essays, how often King returns to this notion of elevating means over ends in a variety of spheres. What can we learn from King about these matters? And how ought we to think about King himself, so often invoked but so rarely studied in any detail? If serious attention to the life, thought of King is indispensable for us, we who are in this room today are in luck, because we have two of the best interlocutors to lead us in such a conversation. Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the Madison Program in American Ideals, an institution at Princeton. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and as a presidential appointee on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Served some years ago on the President's Council on Bioethics, and as a U.S. member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. You have longer, more detailed bios, and if you don't already know a lot about these two, shame on you. Cornel West, a prominent and provocative Democratic intellectual, professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard, holds the title of Professor Emeritus at Princeton. He's taught at Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. Graduated from Harvard in 3 years, obtained a MA and PhD from Princeton, written over 20 books, you know them, Race Matters, Democracy Matters. His most recent book is Black Prophetic Fire, an unflinching look at 19th and 20th century African-American leaders and their visionary legacies. Oh, and he was in The Matrix as well. We can't forget that. More than what they have accomplished and what they represent individually, it is what they have done as friends that commends them to us. They have taught together, undergraduate seminars. They've co-authored writings, including a recent piece on Martin Luther King in the Wall Street Journal just last month. They co-sponsored an important document, Truth-Seeking, Democracy of Freedom of Thought, that affirms the central role of open, rigorous debate in the life of the university, a sadly necessary document. They regularly make appearances to discuss and debate the nature of liberal education and civic friendship. Their friendship is a counter to so much of what ails our public life. I'm delighted to introduce them here today to speak to us about Martin Luther King Jr., his life, legacy, and thought. Please join me in welcoming Robert George and Cornel West.
Well, thank you, Dean Hibbs, and thank you to everyone for coming out to be with us this afternoon. Before I say a few words about my beloved friend and how honored and delighted I am to have him participating in this wonderful program, I want to add my personal words of congratulations and gratitude to House DC for the magnificent, soul-saving, humanizing work that you do. Let's please recognize one another. I'm so proud that this initiative of Baylor's is being co-sponsored by House DC. And I want to recognize someone else in this room, a very dear, beloved friend, who up in Boston is doing exactly the kind of work, difficult, soul-saving, human-affirming work that House DC is doing down here, and that's Pastor Eugene Rivers, my dear beloved friend. Pastor Rivers, are you? There he is. And I also want to recognize another dear friend and hero who is here. Professor Allison Stanger of Middlebury is honoring us with her presence here today, Middlebury College up in Vermont. Now, many of you will know Professor Stanger's name, and you may think that her story is the story of someone who was attacked by a mob at a speech at a college. But that's not really the story of Allison Stanger. She was attacked by a mob at a speech at Middlebury. But the reason that she was attacked is that she has been a stalwart defender of the highest and best academic values and of academic freedom, not only at Middlebury, but throughout the academy. Someone who has been exemplary in facilitating the civil discussion of ideas between and among people who see things from different perspectives but are united in the effort to get at the truth. That's what Cornel and I in our work together have tried to do for 11 years, and that's what Allison Stanger does, and it's what she stands for. And I'm just honored, Allison, that you're here with us. Thank you. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, because I may be crazy, but I'm not a complete fool, the first thing I'm going to do is speak first, because you don't want to follow Cornel West, believe me. You don't want to be the guy that follows Cornel West.
No.
But I'm not going to speak at the usual length at which I speak when we have our public dialogues around the country. Because although I might be crazy, I'm not stupid, and I am not going to pretend to be on a par with Professor West when it comes to discussing the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. So this will be a little bit of an unusual event for us, because I'm going to be more in the role of an interviewer, really, than an interlocutor. And I'm very eager, as I know all of you are in the room, to learn from Brother Cornel. But I want to begin by thanking him, not only for his friendship, but also for working with me now for 11 years. We began teaching together back in 2007 at Princeton, and it has been absolutely the best experience of my 33 years of teaching at Princeton University. We have explored the greatest works of philosophy and literature in the Western tradition. Our courses will typically begin with Sophocles' Antigone. We'll read some dialogues of Plato with our students. We'll read St. Augustine. We'll read some of the Enlightenment thinkers, some of the Reformation thinkers, Luther, Locke, and going all the way up into the 20th century, Du Bois. We'll read Martin Buber, who's invoked by King in the letter from the Birmingham jail. We'll read John Dewey. We'll read C.S. Lewis. We'll read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And as you can see from those readings, we try to engage a wide range of perspectives, because we recognize, we're a couple of guys with some pretty strong opinions, but we recognize nobody has a monopoly on the truth.
That's right.
That was never given to anybody, to have a monopoly on the truth. We have something to learn from each other, even across the lines of religious or theological or philosophical or political difference, and we have a great deal to learn from the great thinkers of the past. That doesn't mean that we think they have all the answers, or that they were without flaws. We're gathered together to celebrate the heritage and legacy of Martin Luther King today. Neither of us believes that Dr. King was without flaws.
That's right.
But he was nevertheless great. Someone from whom we have a profound amount to learn. To say a person's human doesn't mean he's not great. They're great human beings, but we're human beings, and we're frail and we're fallen, and we have our deficiencies. That was true of Plato. That was true of St. Augustine. That was true of Luther. That was true of Locke. That's true of all of us as human beings. But still, we have so much to learn from each other, and we must never assume, we try to communicate this to our students, we must never assume that we have all the answers. Now, that doesn't mean, as Dr. King's legacy and example shows us, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be powerful advocates for what we believe is true and just and right. We must be powerful advocates. But it means that we can never be so certain that we're right that we're willing to close down discussion, freeze the other guy out, not listen to a critic. And this is what we try to communicate to our students. And the other critically important lesson that I take from Martin Luther King's work and his witness is one that Dean Hibbs already referred to, and one that Cornel has emphasized time and time again in our work with students together, looking at King's work, especially the letter from Birmingham jail. And that is the importance of recognizing even your adversary as a fellow human being, someone on a journey, someone who still has miles to go, someone who may still have something to learn, someone that we should not seek to destroy, but we should seek to engage. Not an enemy, but a potential friend. And that friendship begins when we engage in a civil manner with a willingness to listen, not just to preach, but to listen. Preaching's good, Pastor. Yeah, I'm all for preaching. But the best preachers, you can begin that list with Dr. King. The best preachers are also willing to listen and to learn. Look at who King learned from, by his own account. By his own account. He learned from the ancient thinkers. Ancient pagan Greek. Christian pastor learned from Plato and Aristotle. Protestant pastor. But look at that letter from Birmingham jail. Who's he invoking? Who did he learn from? St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. Christian minister, but he invokes Buber. Mm-hmm. And he's locked arm in arm with Heschel, the great Jewish thinkers. He wasn't closed off to learning from anybody who had something to teach. And of course, Gandhi, who was not a Christian. He was a great admirer of Jesus. He famously said to us Christians, you know, I like your Christ. I don't like your Christians so much. Which is an indictment of us as Christians, those of us who are Christians, that we're not sufficiently Christ-like. This great outsider, looking at us from the outside, formed in the Hindu tradition, the great Hindu tradition, the great tradition of the East, looking at us from the outside and seeing everything to love about Jesus Christ, but seeing us, because we are frail and fallen, seeing us, Christians, falling down when it comes to living up to that legacy of Jesus. And King, of course, learned from Gandhi. It's very important to understand, by the way, because this is often misunderstood and misrepresented. King's Gandhianism, his non-violent approach to social change, that was not adopted by King as an expedient technique to win a victory. If you think that, you have not understood King, and you probably haven't read him. Because if you read him, you understand that he understood that as a matter of Christian conviction. He learned something about his Christian faith from Gandhi's nonviolence. Now, as it happened, it was an effective political tool, but that's not, in the first instance, why he adopted it. He adopted it out of conviction. What conviction? Love of enemy. Hardest Christian teaching there is. We can live up to most of them if we try hard enough. I don't know very many of us, certainly not me, who can live up to that one without an awful lot of assistance from up above. To live up to love of enemy, you know, love your friends, yeah, love your family, that's okay. You know, love people who agree with you, love people who look like you, love people who pat you on the back and tell you how wonderful you are, but loving your enemy. But King also noticed that doesn't mean the fact that we need to love our enemy and therefore practice nonviolence, try to achieve our goals without resort to violence. The fact that we love our enemy doesn't mean we don't have enemies. He understood there was evil in the world. Now, this is a very interesting thing that I learned from Eugene Genovese, the great historian of the American South and of slavery, and who has written so tellingly and interestingly on King's theology and contrasted the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. with the theology of Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr. And that is, if you look at the trajectory of King's thought, you'll find that he's very heavily influenced, especially in his early years, by German liberal Christian theology. A theology that puts the emphasis on the inevitability of progress. Arc of history is long, but it leans toward justice. The inevitability of progress and the perfectibility of man. He's thinking of figures, he's influenced by figures here like Harnack, Schleiermacher, Ritschl, that German liberal Protestant tradition, which was so influential in the United States in that period leading up to the First World War, when there was a strong reaction from neo-orthodoxy and figures like Karl Barth, when things didn't look so pretty anymore, humans didn't look so perfectible anymore. What he didn't have hold of course, but what Daddy King understood absolutely perfectly, was the Christian doctrine of original sin. But if you look at the trajectory, you'll see him moving more and more toward a realistic, orthodox Christian understanding of human fallenness, frailty, fallibility. We are not perfectible. Progress is not inevitable. We can rise and we can fall, which means by the grace of God we have to struggle every day. There's not some trajectory or force of history that's going to push us in a positive direction and inevitably lead to heaven on earth. That's not going to happen. So you see King moving in a more orthodox direction. He's got a very fine education, beginning at Morehouse College under people like Benjamin Mays.
That's right.
He goes to Crozier Seminary. We have a friend here today from Crozier I met earlier in Pennsylvania, and then up to Boston University School of Theology, where he comes under the influence of Professor Brightman, a strong exemplar of that liberal Protestant German tradition. Has a huge impact on King's thinking, really kind of moving him away from his father's Orthodox Christianity, more in that other direction. But it's his work in the trenches, in the movement, dealing with flesh and blood human beings, that moves him back toward his father's view, toward a more orthodox understanding, especially of the fallenness and sinfulness of the human being. And that gives him a compassion which enables him to see, even in his enemies, a fellow human being and a struggler. They may have fallen into sin, injustice, horrible evils, but for the grace of God go on. And we all have our own sins and evils and fallenness to deal with. And that can be overcome with the help of Jesus. And so you see that trajectory of thought. He never repudiates what he learns from people like Brightman. He never repudiates that in any kind of formal sense. But you see him having the experience of working in the movement, moving him back theologically toward his father. And that confirms that famous aphorism that's attributed to G.K. Chesterton, that original sin is the one Christian doctrine for which there is irrefutable empirical evidence. We all know we're sinners. We all know deep down we're not perfectible.
That's true.
You know, that flaw in the human is in all of us. And we need to work to overcome that. But we know we can't overcome it on our own. That is God's grace.
That's right.
Working inside us. So there's a little bit of reflection from me just on the spiritual and intellectual trajectory of King, aspects of which I think have been overlooked and to some extent lost by the inevitable transformation of King because of his heroism into a kind of plaster saint, where now everybody holds up Martin Luther King as a hero. From the right to the left, to the middle, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, everybody agrees Martin Luther King is a hero. But in that heroism, we kind of sanitize him. And we lose track of the flesh and blood human being and his struggles and his development and the development of his thought. But I think it's very important for us to recapture that. And remember, even in the movement, he wasn't always loved. He wasn't always loved. It wasn't just the segregationist, racist critics who had a problem with King. A lot of people thought he's too soft. A lot of people didn't want to go for that nonviolence. Malcolm X's famous speeches, never mentioning King's name, but clearly directing the fire right at King, calling him the house Negro. Stokely Carmichael disparagingly referring to King as the Lord. This was the reality that King was dealing with. It wasn't that everybody agreed, we got a hero here. It was only after April 4th, 1968, when he was assassinated, when he was martyred, that we began to have now the heroic King. But if that witness is going to inspire us to do the work that we have to do now, the work in the social sphere that House DC and Pastor Rivers do, the work in the political sphere, the work in the educational sphere, then we have to recover the real King. Over to you, my brother.
Ooh. No, it's rich. Rich. No, it's just always a joy to be in dialogue with my dear brother Robbie. That he's not just intellectually erudite, but he's got a gentleness and spirit in conversation, just as he has a tenacity in taking a stand. He is my very dear brother. He is my friend, and his friendship and brotherhood have enriched my life in immeasurable ways. My daughter considers him a kind of uncle because of his deep love and because of his magnificent compassion for her and my family. And so for me, it's just as natural as breathing that I travel around the country with my conservative brother. People say, oh my God, Brother West, how did you and Robbie come together? I said, have you met him? Have you sat down and talked with him? You don't have to disagree with somebody to have a profound brotherhood and friendship. And when I was blessed to meet his parents, it was clear that they exemplify what I call a spiritual nobility. There they are right there. That's Sister Catherine. But give it up again, Sister Catherine, Brother Joe. Spiritual nobility. And what I mean by that is an integrity and an honesty and a compassion that they bequeath to this brother and other sibling. And we got the cousin here with his beloved wife and so forth. That makes a difference. That George connection is something else. Not just in the looks. Which is strong, but it's in what I call soul craft. And there's so many others who are here. It's true with Brother Eugene and I go back almost 45 years, and we've been wrestling with each other over the same kinds of issues. The problem of evil. How do you hold on to Christian faith? How do you wrestle with trying to be a force for good in such a cold and cruel world? And I do want to thank my brothers and sisters at Baylor, because see, as a Baptist, I don't get a chance to be so thoroughly connected with Baptist institutions. I think it's Colby and Brown was one of the few Baptist ones, but Baylor, the largest Baptist campus in the world. That's very serious business. And Texas is a very special place for me because my mother grew up in Orange, Texas. And so when I think of Texas, I don't think right away of Brother George Bush. I think of Irene B. West. People need to understand Texas has a whole lot of different kind of people in it. Absolutely. And I want to thank my brothers and sisters at AEI for facilitating our coming together. We've been there before and had a magnificent time, Brother Arthur. And of course, last but in no ways least, is House DC and the work that you're doing. Right now, William Barber, Poor People's Campaign in this chocolate city. Less chocolate every day, but still chocolate. Wrestling with the legacy of our dear brother Martin Luther King Jr. And I think when we say Brother Martin's name, we ought to shake and shiver and even shudder like Faust in the realm of the Mothers and Gerda's great classic. not because he's a god or a deity, but because as a human being, he decided to be true to the best of his fallible ability to his calling. And his calling was, as he said, to be a Christian minister, aspiring to what the Greeks call arete, excellence. Not primarily civil rights activist. It's not primarily a product of the black community, even though he's so grounded in the black community. He was first and foremost called by the Almighty to be a Christian minister. Now, what does that mean? It means that he comes out of a tradition. The last thing we ever want to do with Brother Martin is view him as some isolated icon on a pedestal to be viewed in a museum. He's a wave in an ocean of a tradition of a people who for 400 years so deeply hated but taught the world so much about love and how to love. So when you think of Martin Luther King Jr., just put on John Coltrane's Love Supreme and see the connection. I read love-soaked essays for James Baldwin, or Toni Morrison's Beloved. Put on Marvin Gaye's What's Going On and listen to the love shot through every note and the silence between the notes. Or turn on some Ray Charles or Stevie Wonder's Love in Need of Love. Here's the people who at our best, we got our gangsters and our thugs like any other community, but at our best, given all of the hatred and animosity coming at us, decided to constitute what the Isley brothers call a caravan of love. A love of truth, and the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. It's a love of beauty. There is no production of beauty without wrestling with tear and trauma. Rilke taught us well. There is no love of goodness without wrestling with evil. And in his case, a love of God, a love of the holy. So to invoke Chesterton, I'm so glad you did, because Gilbert Keith deserves so much more attention. I highly recommend the great biography by Ian Kerr on Chesterton. Chesterton's coming back strong. He needs to be embraced critically. But he talks about heroic humility. And that reminds us of Brother Martin. You begin as cracked vessel. You begin acknowledging one's inadequacies, or what Samuel Beckett would call try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. That's the Beckett of the last work of fiction and Wordsworth whole. Now, Beckett is a lapsed Protestant Irish brother. Well, he's agnostic, but that Christian sensibility is still shot through his Velton Shawan, even as he pulls back on any cognitive commitment to God talk. That's very important. James Baldwin, the same way. W.B. Du Bois, the same way. We Christians are those of us who choose to be Christians, and we love our Muslim brothers and sisters, Jewish brothers, Buddhist brothers, Hindu brothers and sisters, and others across the board, agnostic, atheists, and what have you. But we learn from everyone. That's Brother Martin, heroic humility. If we're inadequate, that means that we ought to be jazz-like. We ought to not just lift our voices, but recognize you can't lift your voice without bouncing your voice off that of others. And it takes unbelievable courage to find your voice, because most of us are echoes. We're just locked in the chains of conformity. Copies rather than originals. Imitations rather than creations. Willing to accept the ways in which we're socialized rather than to wrestle with what it means to be in the world but not of the world. Martin Luther King Jr. took that dialectical interplay with an existential seriousness. What does it really mean to be in the world but not of the world? And when you're in the world, you're connected to a kingdom, you're connected to a beloved community, and you live your life as if you are part of that beloved community in a world so shot through with hatred and envy and contempt and domination and oppression. That means you're going to be wading in the water, God gonna trouble that water. You're gonna get into a whole lot of trouble. You're going to be not conformed but transformed by something that makes no sense whatsoever in the eyes of the world, because you're continually struggling against the idols of the world, because you're connected to a vision that tries to break through your own brokenness, tries to break through your own fallenness, so that they can see a spirit that can not just bring people together, but straighten their backs up to give them some way of looking at the world, as opposed to conforming to the cold and cruelness of the world. That's what's wonderful about this gathering. There's a sweet spirit in this place. It's tangible. And it has something to do with the fact that you all yourselves bring something to it. It has something to do to crack vessels like Brother Robbie and myself. Year after year after year, it could be in chocolate cities and parts of Dallas with the young folk. Or it could be with very well-to-do folk in Dallas, the Harlan Crows and others. But we're always the same. Why? Because Brother Martin Luther King Jr., as a Christian, tried to say what he meant and mean what he said. It wasn't fake and phony. That's Christian soulcraft. That stands in stark contrast to what is dominant in our society, is what I call neoliberal soulcraft. And neoliberal soulcraft is wanting to be the smartest in the room. Everybody can see how intelligent you are and how sophisticated and cultivated you are, especially on your way to access to status and money and position and spectacle and image. And that's why our young people are in such deep spiritual drift, adrift. They don't see enough Christian soulcraft. What they see is neoliberal soulcraft, that superficial stuff. Martin Luther King Jr. with his PhD could have been lounging well in Martha's Vineyard every summer. He could have been living large. He could have turned his back on poor and working people. He could have conformed himself to the lukewarmness in the black community. That's why he was not popular, as people say, in the black. When he died, 51% of black people opposed him. 72% of white brothers and sisters opposed him. How could you oppose Martin Luther King Jr.? Just see what his calling is. He never got a majority in any poll of popularity. He got close to 49%. How can that be? Because when you're a Christian, and if the world is patting you on the back to such a way that everybody's crazy about you, you need to check yourself. You need to check yourself. How can you follow Jesus? We used to sing a song in my church. Jesus bear the cross alone and all the world go free. No, there's a cross for everyone. And there's a cross for me. You pick up your cross. You want to be God-like, get ready to be crucified. You want to be God-like, learn how to love in such a way that you look crazy in the eyes of most of the world, no matter what color, no matter what sexual orientation, no matter what gender, no matter what national identity. You're cutting over against. That cuts so much deeper than any political ideologies of left and right and center and so forth. You're talking about a spiritual level of integrity, honesty, decency. That's what Rabbi Heschel meant when he said the future of America depends on the impact and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't just talking about your political position. He was talking about the quality of the people in that society. But they become so market-driven that all they're concerned about is smartness, money, status, power. Because once they take over, then Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is one of spiritual blackout, or we could say whiteout, depends on what kind of metaphors you want to use. But we know what we're talking about. Spiritual emptiness, vacuity, hollowness, shallowness. So it becomes even radical to tell the world, I love my conservative brother. What's so radical about that? It ought not be radical at all. It's not radical to me. Because I come from the same tradition that Martin was. I learned in Vacation Bible School. Charitable Christian hatred. That's Martin King. You hate the sin and love sinner. Because you were a gangster before you met Jesus, and now you are a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. So anytime you call people gangster, you talk about something inside of yourself. I talk about the gangster proclivities of Donald Trump. I think I got some evidence, but that's another issue. But that's not the main point. I'm talking about something inside of me that I'm wrestling with all the time. That's Martin King in each sermon. Sinner that I am, God used me. He learned that in Benjamin Mays. He learned that at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He learned that in a tradition that goes all the way back to Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and a host of others. How do we pass that on? And I want to stop here with Brother Martin, because I think there's a sense in which Martin cries such thick tears from the grave when he looks at America, especially young people in America. It's reminiscent of the greatest character of love ever rendered on the American stage, written by a genius named Lorraine Hansberry in her mid-20s from the south side of Chicago in a play called A Raisin in the Sun. There's never been a figure like Mama. That's right. We love Arthur Miller, we love Tennessee Williams, we love Eugene O'Neill, we love August Wilson, we love a host of the other playwrights. But Lorraine puts a Martin Luther King Jr. like, John Coltrane like, Mary Lou Williams like love in Mama. And her fundamental question was, what happens when this tradition of love, this caravan of love, runs out of gas? What happens when you can't bequeath it and transmit it to the younger generation? That's one reason why House DC is so crucial. It's not just the resources you dispense. It's what you exemplify in your care for them, your commitment to them, the integrity they see in you that gives them another way than the way of the street. And that way of the street is thou shalt not get caught, the 11th commandment of neoliberal culture. Thou shalt not get caught. Just do anything. Just don't get caught. Be successful by any means. Malcolm X didn't have that in mind when he said by any means necessary. Yeah. No. And this cuts across race, color, and so forth. So when we talk about Martin King, you've got to look at the world through his own moral and spiritual lens before we even get to the politics. Yes, he's talking about poverty. He's got critiques of greed at the top, just like he's got critiques of greed at the bottom. He's got critiques of capitalism when it's predatory and generates vast inequalities. But he's got his critique of communism when it's regimenting and repressive. Now, he didn't hit patriarchy that strong. And in his own life, patriarchal to the core. He didn't hit homophobia and transphobia too hard. In fact, he wrote various essays in Ebony, highly critical of any kinds of relations and so forth. Bobby and I wrestle with this all the time. How do you love human beings and still have your own critiques of particular kinds of actions and deeds and so forth? And we argue over the actions and deeds. But Martin King was a human being. He was a human being, but oh my God, we need him so now. Not in the form of imitation. There'll never be another Martin, just like there'll never be another Fred Astaire.
Yeah, that's true.
Frank Sinatra. Sarah Vaughan. That high quality. It's no longer available. The culture that produced it's no longer in place. I tell young folk now, some of y'all making millions of dollars and can't even sing in tune. Carmen McRae, Nat King Cole, turn over in their grave. Luther Vandross, turn over in his grave. They hit the notes right. You ask them what key they in. What key you talking about? Sing in key, girl. But they got $10 million. That's neoliberal. culture, all that superficial, surface stuff, conspicuous consumption. All about spectacle. Martin King wasn't about spectacle. It was about substance. We're losing that. We're losing that. And that's one of the things that brings my dear brother Robbie and I together. That he is a brother of substance. So when we disagree, we really disagree. It's not that little superficial stuff up here. And when we agree, we really agree. But our love, our respect is non-negotiable because it's been tested. Amen. And when things are tested, you got a testimony. Martin Luther King's life was a testimony for love. Love is what, justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. He was a tender man. He was a kind man. He was a sweet man. His smile wasn't superficial. His grin was not one of mockery. It was genuine. It's what Ashford and Simpson called the real thing. That's what young folk are hungry for these days. I'm sorry to go on so long.
No. You keep going.
No. You keep going. No, I'm going to hand it right back to you, my brother. I'm going to hand it right back to you, definitely. Hand it right back to you. Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Like I said, you don't want to follow that, do you?
No.
I have to tell you, I'll interrupt our serious discussion to just tell you my favorite Cornel story. I have so many Cornel stories that hard to pick a favorite, but I think this is my favorite. And this happened the last time that Brother Cornel and I were together with my beloved parents here, my father and mother. We were together at the Supreme Court of the United States. I was being sworn in as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom by Chief Justice Roberts. My parents were there. We had obtained, it was actually, I just invoked Cornel's name, and it was the magic word that enabled me to obtain Harriet Tubman's Bible from the Tubman Museum in Auburn, New York, to be sworn in on. They were so kind.
That was beautiful.
They were so kind. They sent the Bible, this magnificent Bible, by the way. And you can imagine what a Bible like that would have cost a poor woman like Harriet Tubman. That tells you something about her Christian faith, that she would have that Bible. But they sent down the beautiful Bible for me to be sworn in, and Cornel did me the very high honor of agreeing to hold the Bible for me when I was being sworn in by the Chief Justice. But we were walking up the steps together, my mom and dad, and Cornel and myself, up the steps of the Supreme Court, that marble temple, that magnificent marble temple. And we were smiling and chatting. When I see Cornel, a smile drops out of his face, and I see him lock eyes with a police officer there, who gave him a stern look. And I see the two of them just stop for a second and look at each other. And then we continue on. And I said, Brother Cornel, what was that about? And he said, well, Brother Robbie, the trouble is, the last time I was here, it was to get arrested, and that officer arrested.
That same guy.
Now I'm going in, carrying Harriet Tubman's Bible to be sworn in by the chief. He said to me, Brother Rob, I think this is the first time I've been to the Supreme Court except when I was here to be arrested.
That's true. That's true.
We had a wonderful time. Yes, indeed, we did.
And Brother Roberts was very kind. Very kind. Yeah,
so back to Martin Luther King. I think what he had hold of, and this I think helps to explain his commitment to nonviolence, his love of neighbor, his love of enemy, his willingness to learn from people with very different perspectives. I think behind it all is I'll put it first in secular terms, and then we can talk about the religious dimension of it. His appreciation of the profound and inherent and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. That's why that's, I think, what spared him from this natural human tendency that we all feel, that it's so hard to overcome,
called tribalism. It's so easy for us human beings to form tribes and clans and groups and to divide the world up into the insiders and the outsiders, into the friends and the enemies. And that's difficult to overcome. I think that in itself is a kind of manifestation of human fallenness, of original sin. Now, how was it that he was so free of that? Well, it was the appreciation of this sense that all human beings are brothers. That's one way to put it. Of course, that was the original title of Letter from Birmingham Jail. All men are brothers. The Negro is your brother. That was the way it was titled. But it's this sense that our dignity as human beings is inherent. It's not something anybody earned or achieved. It doesn't vary because you're smarter than the other guy, or prettier than the other gal, or stronger than somebody else. Now think about what that means, because we naturally, especially in this celebrity culture, but I think this is all times and all places, tend, for obvious reasons, to think more highly of people who are smarter, who are stronger, who are prettier, who are more talented, and we rank and evaluate people. Sometimes we even fall into the error of trying to think of groups in that way. This group is better than that group, and so forth. But the Christian message has always been that all of those differences, which we can reasonably take into account for some purposes, for college admission, you can admit people on the basis of SAT scores and IQ performance and so forth and so on. But the Christian message is that all of those differences are relative. They're relativized by the fundamental point, which is that in basic worth and dignity, well, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. In basic worth and dignity, each and every one of us, no matter how poor, no matter how weak, no matter how vulnerable, no matter how broken, handicapped, cognitively disabled, is the equal of anyone else. I mean, it's an amazing thing when you think about the Christian message. This is radical. The thought that a cognitively disabled child, let's say a child with Down syndrome or another cognitive impairment, is every bit the equal in worth and dignity of Albert Einstein or LeBron James or anybody you can think of, no matter how the most beautiful fashion model, whoever it is. Which is why we should recoil in horror if anyone would suggest that we could, let's say, take organs from a cognitively disabled person or from a drug-addicted, poor, homeless person suffering mental illness or what have you, to save somebody we really think highly of, a great sports star, a great physicist or scientist, a great movie star or celebrity or something like that. Now that's a radical idea. That radical human equality that puts everything else in the shade, beauty, intelligence, strength, standing, wealth, all that's in the shade is a radical concept. Now where do we get it? Well, in the Bible, we get it in Genesis 1. This radical teaching that man is made in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of the universe. Now there is a radical concept. That human beings are literally godlike. Dust of the earth, fallen, frail, sinful, and yet made in the very image and likeness of God. And the teaching is not that some are made in the image and likeness of God and others not.
That's right.
That the strong and the powerful or the brilliant or the athletic are made in the image and likeness of God, but others aren't. No, it's that everybody, even again that cognitively disabled person, that drug-addicted or alcohol-addicted homeless person living under the bridge, afflicted by mental illness, seems to have a terrible, terrible life, and yet the equal in fundamental worth and dignity of everybody else because that person is made in the image and likeness of God. This, of course, is what motivates the work of House DC. And it's what motivated the work and witness of Martin Luther King. It seems to me. Absolutely. Now, it wasn't just tribal. My people are being oppressed. Therefore, I'm going to speak up for my people and get them out of oppression. Maybe to just go on and oppress somebody else. We've seen enough of that in history. I know when my work in religious freedom. I mean, one of the tragedies of the human experience of fighting for religious freedom is sometimes people who get religious freedom then they get control, and they oppress other people and deny them their religious freedom. And that's a natural human tendency, isn't it? We want freedom for ourselves. We want to be free from oppression, but then we can become the oppressor. The magnificent thing about King's message is that's not the way we want to operate here. It happens that it's the African Americans who are suffering under this system of Jim Crow and racial injustice. But we need to be there for anybody who is suffering under injustice. It's not because it's my tribe, it's because every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, which is I think helps to explain why King, as he moved forward after the work in the South in the 1950s and then in the 1960s, the Albany campaign, the Birmingham protests, tries to expand the movement into a movement for poor people. Mm-hmm. He a very difficult step for him, which was to come out in opposition to the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
Now, he might have been right or he might have been wrong on the politics of that. People are entitled to their opinions about the Vietnam War. He might have been right or he might have been wrong about any specific policies that he might have advocated to try to deal with the problem of poverty. Reasonable people of goodwill. Cornel and I disagree about some of these things. How much should be market, how much should be government. Those are reasonable differences. But that people in poverty need us to be reaching out to do something about that. That's not contestable. That we need a foreign policy, that we need to be a nation that does justice.
That's right.
We might disagree about exactly what the details of that are. That shouldn't be controversial once we accept the fundamental equal dignity and the inherent dignity of every member of the human family.
Absolutely. I mean, Brother Martin used to say that he would have the same righteous indignation in a fight against black supremacy as he would against white supremacy. That's what Jane Austen, another Christian novelist, called constancy. Where's your moral consistency? How do you get beyond your tribalism? Do you really have spiritual content and moral substance in your view of the world? If it's just a matter of interest group articulation, you don't have a spiritual and moral character to it. It's just self-interest. You see this in Congress all the time. We have no permanent friends. We only have permanent interests. How spiritually impoverished is that? No principles, no vision, no moral sensitivity. It's just your interest. So when the interest is satisfied of your little group, you satisfied. Martin Luther King Jr. shed tears over that. Why? Because he is a disciple of a Palestinian Jew named Jesus of Nazareth, who set such a standard. And you get it enacted actually in the greatest expression of love in the history of black people, which is black music. See, for an unfree people, it's in the music that you get freedom and love. And it's in the music that you get what Jesus was all about in terms of the kenosis, the self-giving and the self-emptying. A distinctive feature of the Christian God and Trinity and so forth is a divine power that is continually giving and emptying itself to embrace others. So when you get a musician on the stage, they come in with the cup full, and when they finish, they're completely empty. John Coltrane finished blowing in the concert, looks like he has completely blown his neck out every night. 3 sets every night. Why? Because he's giving. Al Green can hardly walk. I say that a lot of times with these young folk these days, because in their concerts, the giving is lost. It's just a matter of showing up. It's spectacle. I'm here. Look at me. You didn't think I was going to show up, did you? No, pick up a microphone and sing a song, God dang it. Play your piano. I'm not just here to see you. It's not spectacle. Touch my soul. That's one of the differences between Beyonce and Aretha Franklin.
Yeah, there you go.
Beyonce is the greatest entertainer of her generation. She's magnificent, but she's part of the culture of superficial spectacle. All she got to do is show up, get her girls in formation, sing her songs. When you leave, did she touch you at the deepest level such that your life has been transformed? No, she titillated your body. Neoliberal culture. She stimulated your body. Oh, I see. What about the soul stirs of Sam Cooke and Johnny Taylor and Lou Rawls? They stirring your soul at the deepest level. Well, you see, when that's the model, here comes Martin. He wants to be as free as Mahalia Jackson. There is no Martin without Mahalia Jackson. When he was down and out, thinking about maybe suicide, he had to put on her music. Mahalia was free. She had so much love coming through her voice, mediated with New Orleans and Chicago, with Thomas Dorsey on the piano and Reverend Julius Caesar Clark preaching at Pilgrim's Baptist Church. That's freedom of an unfree people. That's Martin. And white brothers and sisters get in on and say, ooh, wow, this music is something else. And here come a Jewish blues brother named Robert Zimmerman, better known as Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan.
He said, I'm a blues man too. Let me get my guitar out. Shit, I changed my name and started imitating some Mississippi geniuses from the Delta. Here come Bruce Springsteen, working class blues brother from the vanilla side of town. East Street Band, we can go on and on. Elvis Presley, go on and on and on. This is not just narrow narratives about entertainment. This is about all of us who are hungry for deep love, deep freedom, and we find it in human expression no matter how dehumanized the circumstances are. So you ask Frank Sinatra, who's your favorite singer? Billie Holiday. Oh, she was a black woman. Woman, you don't understand what I'm doing. I'm a working class Italian from Hoboken, New Jersey. And it's in Billie Holiday that I see the genius, the freedom, the love. And she's coming out of brothels in Baltimore City with her love and her freedom and her genius. That human level cuts at that level. And in fact, with Martin, without the music, without the human connection, it makes little sense of his ministry. Even though his ministry is centered on Jesus. It is cross-centered, cruciform in that way. Which means, of course, that he's willing to give it all to pay a cost and always be willing to give up his popularity in order to preserve his integrity. That cuts so radically against the grain of our culture, young folk find it almost inconceivable. How you can give up your popularity in the name of something called integrity? What's your problem? Well, I'm trying to be Christian. I thought so. Which is so outside of the domain of so many young folk these days. It's just so far outside of their world. That's how Martin ends up being in a museum rather than as part of their life. What a magnificent challenge, even as we're critical of him as well. Very much so. I know we might want to open it up.
Yeah, we
can. It's
can.
up to our brothers of whoever is the MC. We're here to follow your instruction.
Yeah. Would anyone like to make a comment or ask a question? Over here.
Thank you again for your words today. This is very insightful. All right. So earlier you were talking about, you were giving some critiques of my generation.
Now, don't worry. We do this for free. We're not even going to charge you.
Kind of like internships for my generation. All right. So one of the things you talked about was how we don't really understand the use of sacrifice. And so what would you say about this generation who has been, pardon the language, who has been screwed over by capitalism done the wrong way? And who are, and quite frankly, I think for me, who are a bit suspicious of institutions. And so how then do we fight with what little power we have within the systems? But then also as people of color fighting with
Absolutely.
of this generation is kind of not questioning that power, when in fact I think I see many of the people in my generation trying to fight back within the power that we do have.
Good. Well, thank you for that.
No, that's a
question.
wonderful
I'm going to
question.
go first on the same principle that I articulated earlier. It seems to me that despite the injustices of the past, which should never be whitewashed, it seems to me that we have tried for a long time to live off the capital of Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian, the biblical ethic. But we have been depleting that capital and not paying in. So how does that manifest itself for your generation? And while I don't want to let you off the hook, I do want to note that it's my generation that produced your
That's right.
generation. So if there's fault here,
Absolutely.
my generation has a lot to answer for. What's behind that depletion in the capital? If we think back to 1968, we find not only Martin Luther King's magnificent self-sacrificial, self-emptying work and witness, the kenosis.
Yes, yes.
We also find something called the me generation. I don't know if that means anything to you. My generation called itself the me generation. That was the generation, unlike my father's generation, the greatest generation, that went off and defeated the Nazis in Germany, saved any civilization. Mm-hmm. The me generation said, wait a minute, I'm here to have a great time. I'm here to have a great set of experiences. The world exists for me to take advantage of, to lead my life in a way that's really satisfying. And my generation, the me generation, had a slogan. Now, some of you are of a certain age, my age, and you'll be able to remember that slogan. We could probably all just shout it out together. The slogan of the me generation was, if it feels good, do it. Oh yeah, you're chatting with me. If it feels good, do it. We made feeling our God. And as a result, we live in an age of feeling. We no longer ask, what is the truly good? What should I try to feel good about? What should I devote myself to because it is right and true and good and just? Rather, we ask, what will make me feel good? The sex and drug and rock and roll thing of the 1960s, that was the bad part. The good part was civil rights. But that bad part, the sex and drug and rock and roll, I rather like rock and roll, but you know, the free love thing, that was all part of the if it feels good, do it mentality. Because what made life worth living, we told ourselves, was feeling good. Why drugs? Why the drug culture? It's all about feeling good. Promiscuous, meaningless sex, what was good about that? Pleasure made you feel good. Now, there were a lot of tragic consequences to that. A lot of people paid a heavy price. You want to start that list with Jimi Hendrix? And with so many of the other
Jim Morrison.
yeah, stars who died of drug overdoses and things like that, lives that were wrecked by anarchic sexuality, the collapse of the family structure, especially in the poorest and most vulnerable sectors of the community. But what we bequeathed to you was what I sometimes call the age of feeling. Historians are fond of, I know we have some historians in the room here from Baylor, historians are fond of breaking up the epochs into the age of this and the age of that. So they call the Middle Ages, the medieval period, the age of faith. And that was followed by the Enlightenment. And that the historians call that the age of reason. Now those are oversimplifications, but there's some truth. There was plenty of reason in the medieval period. Think of the works of Aquinas or Maimonides or Al-Farabi or any of the great thinkers. But still, there's a strong sense in which the medieval period was the age of faith, because what was the touchstone of goodness, of justice, of truth? It was conformity to the faith. The age of reason, the Enlightenment, what was the touchstone of goodness and truth? Reason, science, empirical truth. But if the medieval period was the age of faith and the Enlightenment was the age of reason,
our age really can be called the age of feeling. What's the touchstone of goodness and of value and of truth? Feeling. What makes you feel good? And that's not really what it's all about. That's a mistake. It's depleting this capital of Christian civilization, the Judeo-Christian ethic. What matters is what's true, independent of how it makes us feel. What matters is what's right. What matters is what's just. We need to adjust our feelings to truth and goodness, not identify truth and goodness with how we feel. That's how I see it.
No, that's exactly. And I do want to salute the heroic young people who are fighting against what I would characterize as a culture in decay and decline. When you have excessive hedonism, excessive narcissism, very narrow individualism, you're unable to experience the communal dimensions of the human condition, what it means to have quality friendship, what it means to have quality relation. It's I, thou's reduced to I, it, to use Martin Buber's language. So persons become an it to manipulate and dominate rather than a thou whose humanity you revel in. Now, this has always been a challenge in human history. In every generation of human beings, you've had domination, oppression, hatred, envy, resentment, and so forth. But over time, people tried to create certain constraints against the narcissism and the hedonism and so forth. In the last 45 years, what Brother Robbie is calling an age of feeling, narcissism and hedonism, very much tied to marketization, commodification, people making money on generating new needs so that they would become consumers that would buy products to help make more money and more profit and so forth, that you lose deep spirituality and deep morality. So, for example, I've taught in prison for 37 years. It's a blessing to be there. I can't wait to get back to Norfolk where Malcolm X was. I was just there 2 weeks ago. And when I began, they had 200,000 people. Now they got almost 2.5 million. I've seen the change in terms of mass incarceration. But my fundamental message when I get there is it's very clear that the young folk just haven't been loved enough. They haven't been cared for enough. They haven't been attended to enough. People just cold and callous, beginning with the folk around them all the way up to the larger society. And I say to myself, I know when I was growing up, we had a ghetto, but it was a neighborhood. It was not a hood. When Donny Hathaway sang about the ghetto, he was not singing about a hood because there were bonds of sympathy and ties of empathy in that place that was financially, as broke as the Ten Commandments financially. But spiritually and culturally, we had a concern for each other. We had a care for each other, not just individual families, the whole block, the whole neighborhood. That's been shattered. So young folk are up against much more in that way. But, you know, the Kendrick Lamars and Erykah Badu's and others trying in their own ways to respond, and it's very heroic in that way. So we're talking about something in general. That's why it's not a personal attack on Sister Beyonce. Not at all. I begin acknowledging her talent. But she's in a context where spectacle often trumps, well, maybe I shouldn't use that word. Spectacle is primary over substance. I mean, Brother Trump's a good example of that. He really is. He really is. But he's made in the image of God, which means that even he is not fully, his humanity is not fully defined by his deeds. He can change. Just like Malcolm Little was a gangster, and he changed. He was loved by Honorable Elijah Muhammad, changed his life. That love can break the back of fear, break the back of gangster status, break the back. There's something about the power of that love that can change and transform folk. And this is true in our own human experience when you fall in love with other folk. You learn how to die. That's the Christian insight. There is no life and rebirth without death. That's why you need your cross. Learn how to die in order to learn how to live. Learn how to die in order to be reborn into a new being where you carry over elements of that old self that was killed. And when you fall in love individually, if that lonely, isolated, egoistic self is not in some way killed, your relationship won't last too long. Now, if you have a wonderful relationship, you got bittersweet coming. because that's life. But that bittersweet is part and parcel of what Frankie Beverly called joy and pain. And the crucial point is for young folk, modern culture tends to be a joyless quest for insatiable pleasure. So you get all the pleasure in the world and you're still empty. Whereas the Christian insight is, oh, you got a joy that the world didn't give you and the world can't take away. And if you don't find joy in serving the kingdom, you got to go back to the cross. Our churches have turned the blood of the cross into Kool-Aids too often. You just want to dip in order to get your blessing rather than be washed and have your life transformed.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a different spiritual level. But that's true in your personal relationships. If you're just dipping in, you're going to stay on the surface. You better get on down there where the funky and the messy. That's real love. That's real love.
I've very often in our dialogues together heard Cornel say, I am who I am because somebody loved me. I am who I am because somebody loved me. You know, and he doesn't just mean I am the famous Harvard professor who once had an even higher honor of being a Princeton professor.
Before he abandoned me.
Before he abandoned he means I am the person I am. In Cornel's case, a person of such profound integrity, such profound honesty, willing to be honest with himself about himself. Now, how did that happen? Cornel has often said, I am who I am because somebody loved me. I know who loved him. Cornel was loved by Clifton and Irene West, right? It was Clifton and Irene
Joe
West
and Catherine.
together.
Joe
and
and
I am who I
Catherine.
am because somebody, Joseph and Catherine.
Yes,
Right?
Joseph and
Now,
Catherine.
so many of our young people today do not have that advantage, especially when it comes to what they sometimes call tough love.
That's
you know,
right. That's
discipline.
Right. That's right.
People are willing to say, no, you don't live for pleasure. You live for service. You don't live for titillation. You live for what's right, what's
That's right.
true,
That's right.
what's good. The other thing I think we need to do, I just want to encourage, especially young people, to do this. I've been so blessed by my friendship with Cornel over these many years. I want to encourage all young people to overcome the tribal spirit that I see among young people today. Reach out to somebody who is different from you, someone who disagrees with you about something important, somebody who is of a different religion and really believes it, somebody who has a different political viewpoint and really believes it as much as you believe your, and I don't care whether you are Democrat, Republican, right or left, Jewish or Christian, reach out to somebody and get to know them as a friend and listen. Don't just talk, don't just preach. Listen as well as talk. And that is a transformative experience. You will have the blessing that I have had in this relationship, in which we've had with others. Because I'm not an anomaly for Cornel. I'm not the only conservative Cornel, believe it or not. Cornel knows. And Cornel's not the only progressive that I know.
That's right.
He's the only one I really love. He's not the only one I know. I think this gentleman over here had a question or a comment.
Sir, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it for out of the respect for time. But if you want it now for a last word, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
What's the last question?
Last one. You go ahead, sir.
I just wanted you to know, both and the audience, I'm coming from a place of love for love. I remember in the 50s and the 60s studying the work and being a youth in the work of Brother Martin and Brother Malcolm. You know, as I recall, even beyond that, they acknowledge each other's differences, and they also identify about what do we have in common. And they had their exchanges. But when I look at that famous photograph of Brother Martin and Brother Malcolm together, what I see there is two lovable, individuals who are living the divine spirit. And I wanted to know in your future programs that as you speak about messages from Malcolm around Martin, they were never about attacking the person, but rather it was identifying our differences in our ideology. That divine spirit that they both possessed and lived and gave to the world came from one creator. And that's what I do, and that's what I encourage our youth to do, to acknowledge your divine spirit. And let that passion live. So that's my question. If it's possible that you could offer how that divine spirit that they both possess, if you choose to use Malcolm's name, was living their divine spirit, not on a human level, but something much greater than that, that we all see them today and say, oh, what lovable people they are. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that spirit that you're pointing to here is manifested in a trait that the two men definitely had in common, despite their differences. And that was integrity. Integrity. King exemplified that in dozens of ways that are very, very well known to people. Malcolm X is less well known, but he manifested it also in very many ways, including when he was moved, finally, forced, very difficult for him, to break with Elijah Muhammad. Especially after his Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, and his willingness when he returned to say, you know, there's some things that I had wrong. There were some things that I didn't understand, that it was only on the Hajj that I have finally begun to see. To kind of admit to that, not kind of, to admit to that, is an act of integrity. And it's rooted in faith. That integrity isn't just free-floating. It's rooted in that common faith, that belief in God, the idea that we are under a higher power than ourselves. We are not ourselves gods. God is God. We're answerable to God. We make a mistake, we correct the mistake. That's what integrity is. That's what integrity requires. You must have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had more time on that, though, because you know that moment, June 27, 1964, the FBI tells us nobody knew about this when finally they decided to get together. They were going to the UN to bring America on, put America on trial for the violation of human rights. They were going to get together. Malcolm had been open, but Martin would not respond. See, Martin himself was very hesitant to be seen in public with Malcolm X, because up until the Hajj, Malcolm X, given his deep love for black people, his love had not yet spilled over to the vanilla side of town.
That's what the Hajj did.
That's what the Hajj did, see. So Malcolm used to say, sincerity is my only credentials. Both of them used to say, I'd rather be dead than afraid. But Malcolm was still believing white brothers and sisters were devils. Martin says, no, that's not true. It's just not true. Philosophically, theologically, historically, and so forth. So you don't have room for the white brothers and sisters who hate white supremacy. Now, they got a lot of cousins, so it could be a challenge. We were just talking about John Leland and so forth. And a whole host of other white brothers and sisters, a whole cloud of witnesses of white brothers and sisters fighting against white supremacy. Well, if they're all devils, you don't make room for that. Malcolm, when he said that, he meant it. Then he says what? I was wrong. White people are not devils. Now, many of them still have devilish behavior, but they're not devils. And Martin says, oh, now theologically, philosophically, we're much closer together. And of course, that's closer to Orthodox Islam too. Just like close, connected to Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, made in the image of God in that way. And so even Malcolm, given his tremendous freedom, his tremendous love of black people, it took him a while to actually allow that love to spill over with white brothers and sisters who have exactly the same status, exactly the same significance as black, brown, red, yellow across the board.
And of course, King had the experience of working closely with whites like Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Absolutely.
He also had the experience of being bailed out of jail, not in Birmingham, but in Albany, by Billy Graham. Billy Graham, one of the few whites who was invited by King to address him by the name Mike. He was Mike to Billy Graham as he was to those closest to him. So he had that experience of working arm in arm with whites as a Christian minister and as a civil rights activist. Grant, I hate to call this to a close.
I know, and I'm sorry Eugene didn't get his question in. Lord, Lord. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Is that late already?
Thank you for being here.
You right. Bless you, no brother. Bless. What time is it? Did we actually go that?
2 o'clock.